ASP.NET is a framework for building web applications. It's been around since the .NET framework came out and was really an extension to what was called classic ASP, or active server pages. Active server pages allowed us to go out and write inline code to be able to pull together a dynamic environment that then could be hosted out through something like information server. ASP.NET is a framework that brings this .NET goodness into websites and services, and it really provides a lot of great things for giving us a foundation to work from. It supports building applications in multiple languages, so that if you're a developer who is real good with C# or VB, you can write your code in those languages, and then the services will expose that out into controls and things that render it out into HTML. It's a tool-rich environment, which enables us to have great editor experience, great design time experience that allows us to build very complex apps in a minimal amount of time. Developers can leverage your strengths, and you can use this to go out and build applications in a way that works the way that you work. And finally, Visual Studio 2013 includes what they call One ASP.NET. And really, I want to kind of explore what is it and why are they talking about this thing called One ASP.NET. One ASP.NET is really talking about the different ways, the different types of tools and implementation technologies available to the developer. And really, you have two areas. You have how you go out and build sites, and you have ways that you work with services. And the first way that .NET came along with ASP.NET to allow us to build sites was what was called web forms. And it was a derivation from almost Visual Basic on giving us a design surface that had very rich controls. The developer can take those controls, put them on the page, declaratively describe how they're going to work, and write all the code in what is called a code behind file in the language of their choice. Web Forms has the strength of being a design-centric, being easy to get started with, being able to very powerfully connect different ideas and concepts, forms, grids, data together. But it also has some challenges. It has the challenge of view state, how it is able to maintain the data on the backside. How do we simplify the code? If you have a lot of code in a lot of different places, it can become complex. And how do you test all of those different features and areas of the website? MVC was introduced as a response to the scaffolding type languages like Ruby and other environments where I could go out and use the system to go out and create something that ties closely to the database. It has the intent of trying to make it easy to build testable applications and have very tight control to the HTML. And if I used web forms in .NET, how would I go out and include MVC features? And the challenge is, well, maybe I do, maybe I don't. Another way of building websites is what are called web pages. And this is really along the lines of what classic ASP is, and using what's called a razor syntax, be able to go out and write pages where there is no code behind, it's just the code is written right in the page. One ASP.NET says that we want to be able to use all of these different technologies together. On the services side, we've got the classic WCF, or the Communication Foundation, that came along in the .NET 3 timeframe that allows us to map out how services can interact with an XML request coming in, HTTP, and send back data. OData is an example of a service that is implemented using WCF. Another technology that came along based on REST, or a HTTP-based protocol for doing get, put, post, and delete for all the CRUD, is called Web API. Web API as a service is a real powerful tool for making services that can talk to non-web clients and be able to host that data in a common place like in the cloud. And also, how do you build connected applications? SignalR is a technology that we'll look at in a little bit that allows us to asynchronously and dynamically connect to lots and lots of clients. But all of these technologies in One ASP.NET in 2013 and in .NET 4.5.1, the whole idea is to make it easier to use the technology that fits with the problem and what we're trying to do. Which one do you choose, or when would you choose more than one? One ASP.NET means that we want to be able to connect to all of these. Building with ASP.NET, if you're doing web forms, you might choose this if you're developing something where you've got a designer who is working with browser-based applications. You want to have an intuitive, easy to get started, be able to see how things are coming together. The focus is really on controls and having a very rich control set of things like data grids and menus and items where I want to be able to simulate a stateful environment and have the application render it out in a way that it pulls back the data and shows us what's going on. ASP.NET Web Forms solution is really all about building these types of solutions. Controls end up rendering out HTML and JavaScript and CSS as needed, and in the evolution of ASP.NET, it's gotten better and better at giving us more control over how that data gets actually rendered. But we have this thing called ViewState, which manages the information about the session, which gets pushed out to the page, which includes a fairly sizable payload that has to be maintained. But the upside is you do have lots of rich UI controls. And then you can use the drag and drop to go out and do the design. Building with web pages is where I've got similar to a classic ASP inline syntax for building websites using what's called Razor syntax. It does away with the code behind, so I'm actually writing the code within the page. You have a single page model for all the markup and all the code, and you don't need to go out and build a project, but you can just write code and then refresh the browser, and it will then go through and get everything it needs to be able to run the application. And it's a fairly similar model to how MVC works for rendering out the pages. So it's still using that same similar kind of syntax where I've got very tight control over the HTML, and I can use that for building my apps. With MVC is a model view controller approach for building web applications introduced in Visual Studio 2010, .NET 4. And what MVC does is it allows us to go out and separate the different areas of the application, the data into a model, the view being the presentation layer, and then a controller that kind of talks between the two and handles all the business logic. And by working in this kind of an environment, we're really able to separate out the different areas of the application, what they call separation of concerns. And it simplifies things like doing unit testing and organizing the code so that it's easier to work in a very complex application with a team of people by having the application broken out into all those different areas. You have absolute control over the HTML and markup, and that is a real important part of it, as well as the ability to be flexible and extensible, take advantage of different kinds of frameworks and plug them in where we need them for our development. Now, building with services, something that's new, that may be new to you, is what's called Web API. So Web API follows a pattern called REST, which is the acronym for Representational State Transfer. And using that, it uses the standard HTTP verbs, what the protocol includes for get, put, post, and delete, to do insert, update, delete of data. And through that protocol, it talks back through JSON. It uses the standard formats where I can get XML or as JavaScript objects or as whatever I decide to send back and forth. Working with things like the Entity Framework, it provides a very powerful way to be able to go out and expose out a data pattern for my application to be able to consume that data and very quickly build solutions that can work with the data. Let's take a look at how we can build applications using OneASP.NET. So let's take a look at what OneASP.NET means to us. When I go out and I start Visual Studio, I'm running Ultimate Edition, but you could be running Professional or Premium. You could even be running the Visual Studio Express products. They're all going to have the same kind of technology and things that we're looking at. Now, I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to take a look at the options that are here. Now, in previous versions in Visual Studio 2012, when I created a new project, you might have seen something that looked like this. Do I want to do an AJAX server control? Do I want to do a web forms or maybe MVC4? But all of these options were very complex, and it implied that if I chose one of the technologies, I couldn't use the other ones. In 2013, you have just a single ASP.NET web application. So let's go out and we're going to create just a simple my ASP demo, and I'm going to create an initial one that's just going to be a web application. Now, the options I have for the templates are either an empty template where I can go out and start with nothing and then add the parts that I need. I could also go ahead and create a web forms or an MVC or a web API. Each of these includes a set of technologies. So for instance, if I go into web API, you'll see that the references are going to automatically be included for MVC and web API. If I go to web forms, then I have the web forms turned on. But these checkboxes imply that I can do more. Maybe I want to also include web API in my references when I create the project. Or maybe I want to add unit tests on a web form project. As I go through and create the application, I can choose the technology or the base approach that I want to use for this application, but I can also use the other parts of it. Let's see how we do this. I'm going to create just a simple web forms application. This is going to initialize and create a project using a template. The templates are going to look very similar across the different technologies. So the way that it's going to render out the app, if I go ahead and just do an F5 and run this, is that it'll start up the page and show me the content, and it'll be very similar no matter whether I'm doing MVC or forms or pages. I have contents that have a menu on the top. I've got links to different things. And as I go through, you'll see that the URI even is a clean URI. So I've got some routing going on saying, the about page is not the about.aspx. So URIs are going to be cleaner and work better in the .NET 4.5 timeframe. Now, this is a web forms application. If I take a look at the assets of what got created for me, I can see that I've got, for instance, the site master file. And what this has is a markup that will be injected and pull in from content placeholders into each of the different pages that use that master. So I've got a master for the standard site, and I've got one for mobile. And then I have pages that are created. Another thing that got created is some scripts, some models, different folders that have pieces of information that I might want to be able to go out and use. So for instance, if I go into the default page, I can see here's what I've got. It's using a master page file of site.master. I've got a content placeholder for main content, which is then going to inject this stuff inside of that master page. Now, working with web forms is one way of coding, but maybe I've got something where I need to be able to expose data out. And to do that, I can right-click on the project and then go down to the add. And you'll see from the add method, I've got not just new item up here, but I also have scaffolding item. I also have references. I've got recent things that I've added to my project. So these get listed down here as well. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a new scaffolding item to our project. And I'm going to call this my just a simple web API. We're going to call this a values controller, just a simple data source that I might want to consume from this. We'll call this values. Say add. And it's going through and it's doing something called scaffolding. And it gives me a README text that says, okay, look, I'm now using web API inside of a web forms. And there's a couple of things I need to do. One is that in my global ASAX is I need to add something to register where my controllers are going to live. And so you'll see up here I've got this web API configuration file that got added. If I take a look at that, you'll see it's got the registering, which then takes the API syntax as to where these routes are going to be placed, and then allows me to go to the controller and the ID of that within this web forms app. In my global ASAX file, I've got to do one thing, and that is to add this line, which will actually call that configuration and set it up within our app. So let's go into the global ASAX. I'm going to come over here, and we'll just paste that in. Now, it doesn't know about this global configuration because I don't have the using statement for it. So doing the control period allows me to go out and add the system web HTTP. But by doing that now, I've registered those routes. So it's going to go into the controller location to look for those files. So it's actually going out to the controller directory. So down here, I've got my values controller. I'm just going to drag that and put that into the controller folder. And then inside of this, I've got a class that is going to implement this thing called the API controller. Now, the API controller is a means for allowing me to go out and create logic to handle the common HTTP verbs of get, put, post, and delete. To implement one, I can do a public method and have a return type of like IEnumerable of, say, string. And then I can say, okay, the method's called get, so I'm going to return back a collection of things. And inside of this, I'm going to have a return new string array, and we'll pass in a couple of strings. Hello world. One ASP. And if I go over here and just put this in and return it, now I've got a method out here for the get. Now I could also have other methods that are going to do other things. So for instance, I might have, here's some other value controller methods. So for instance, if I want to go out and return back a specific entity, I might have a parameter passing in an ID and returning back a specific value. I might also be passing in things like the post and the put to do updates or inserts or the delete. So I can create the logic to handle this. But the thing is, when I run my application, if I go over here and just press F5, it's going to open up the application. You'll see that I come out to my default environment. If I go up and I go out to where the convention is API/values, it's now going to run that method and then iterate through and do some work. So I can see down here my values.json file is being opened up. If I click on open, now it's going to say, okay, well, let's open this up. And you can see there's my return hello world from 1ASP.net. And so it's very easy to go out and add other types of technologies, like adding the MVC or the web API to a WinForms. Maybe I want to do something even a little bit more interesting. So I've got my default page and I've been rendering and building out code and using the controls. Maybe I want to do some real true MVC stuff using Entity Framework. I could go and I could create a model. Let's go ahead and add a class here. We'll call this our person class, which gives me a class for a person. I can add some properties. So I might have an ID, person ID. I might also have a property for the names, like first name, and another one, do a property for last name. And with this, we might have some data that I want to be able to go out and expose. Now, if I go out and I take this, let's go here. I'm just going to go ahead and build it so we've got it in our logic. Is I can take this class, this model, and I might want to expose it out and do something with MVC. So if I right-click on my controllers, I can say add, and this time let's go out and add a new scaffolding item. And this time I'm going to do an MVC controller with the Entity Framework. So it's using views. And so instead of just giving me the get, put, post, and delete, it's now going to wire that up to some markup language that I can use on the front end. So let's go out and we'll call this my people controller. And the people controller is going to use my person class. And I'm going to add a data context. Now the data context is like the layer that allows me to connect up the model into the view. And so the data context is going to be like the connection to the database. We're going to create a new one. We'll call this demo data context and add. And then we're going to go out and create some Razor markup for how this is going to be put together. Click on the scaffolding, and now it's going to go through and it's going to add a couple of other things to our project to make this all work. So in the scaffolding, it'll add a folder for views. It'll add a controller for the people controller. It's also going to require a couple of other routing information in the global ASAX. So we'll go ahead and we'll add these lines of code because these got added to our app start. So let's go over to global ASAX, and after we've done this, we'll just add that. And the area registration, you do a control period and add the system web MVC. That'll add the areas for MVC. It's got some filters and it's got some bundles. I'll see that inside of my project I now have views. So for instance, for people, I've got to create I've got a list on the index, so it'll go through and list out all the information. It's scaffolded out the first name, last name, and email from my model, so it knew about what that stuff was. It also created a people controller that has a data context that got created for me that then ties into the view, which returns back the view of the people.to list. So very quickly and easily, I can take my web forms app that's got my master pages. It's got my web API for the values. I can click on Internet Explorer, and now I can try to run it. Let's go ahead and run this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to People, and the People controller should route out to where my people views are. So if I click on this and enter it, now it's going to take me over to where I can see data that's going to be created for this. Now, in .NET 4.5.1 and Visual Studio 2013, it includes what's called local database, and so it's created a local database for storing this data. So I haven't connected it to a database or told it where that database is, but I can get to it from here. Let's go ahead and put in some data here. Mike Benkovich and Mike at benko.com and create. I might also have another person who's going to do some testing for me. I am and tester. I'm a tester at benko.com. And you'll see that I have data actually showing up inside the application. How did that get created? Where did that get created? And how do I work with it? Well, it's actually been created in this thing over here, where if I show all files, you'll see that there's my demo data. If I double click on it, this data context got created for me that has my people data inside of it. And what's interesting is that it's got the design laid out, and it created the database for me at runtime to map out and store the data for me. So the people table got created with a first name, last name, and email using an nvarchar max. I might also have other data in here, like maybe I want to show a website or a URL. I might want to be able to modify this model. So if I want to change the model, I can always go down here to the person table and say, let's add something like, say, phone number. Now, in order to enable this phone number to actually get put into the database, because you saw that our design doesn't have that field, what I can do is I can go out and we'll save this, but I can go in and using the what's called NuGet, which is a tool inside Visual Studio that lets me add coding capabilities. I can go under Tools, go down to Package Manager, and then run the Package Manager console. Is I can use a new feature in .NET 4.5.1 for what's called database migrations that takes the entity framework and extends it out and then handles all the database changes for me. So what I can do is I can go up here and I can say enable migrations. And when I do this, it's going to identify that I've already got an identity model in here, and I've got this demo data context, so it's going to throw an error. But it does give me this, which tells me, okay, well, here's how I'm going to do this with my specific demo data context. So I'm going to use this. To enable migrations, use the command enable migrations dash and then the actual syntax. So let's come down here, paste that in, and I'm specifying that I'm going to enable migrations for this particular data context. Click on, type it in and press return. And now it's going to add a migration folder for me, and then it's going to initialize the code for creating that database. So here's where the initial creation got put together. It has something that's going to go out and create the actual code. It's got some seed methods for actually loading up the data. If I come here and I say add migration, and we said what, phone number? And now it's going to go out and it's going to determine what's different. And it recognized that there's a new column I added in my class that maps into that data. So there's my phone stuff, and I can say update database. It'll actually push that data out into the data store for me and run the seed method so that I can continue running. So if I go out here into my into my model, and I see there's my person model, and I've got the phone number. If I go to the people controller, one of the things I've got here is this index that's got the list of what's going on. If I click on details and I right click here, I can say add view, and right now the view only has information about the first name, last name, and email. If I add the view, it's going to overwrite the model that's there and add the additional pieces of information. So I can go ahead and say yes, replace it, and now it's going to add that details for that view controller. Let's go back here. So there's my details, and say add view. It should update it, and I'm going to use the template for my details, and this is then going to wrap up everything that I need. There's my demo context, and my model class I'm going to use for this details is going to be the person model, and say add, and it's going to replace it. And what it'll do is now go through that model and iterate all the different properties and add that information into it. So then when I come down here to my details on person, you'll see there's my first name, last name, email, and phone number. So if we run the application now we've got the master page running with the web forms. We've got our API, and we can go over here to people. And it pulls up the information about the person. I can click on details, and now if I had the phone, I could go back to that, and I'd be able then to edit and work with that additional data. So OneASP.net makes it easy for us to work with whatever the technology and use the entire framework for building applications.